The ledger had been wrong for 3 years. Nobody had said so. That was the thing about a great house. The wrong things had a way of persisting inside them, long past the point where anyone with eyes could see the wrongness, because the people with eyes were also the people whose bread depended on keeping quiet, and keeping quiet was a skill the hungry learned faster than any other. The ledger in question was the household accounts book of Calverstone, seat of the Duke of Calver, and it sat on a desk in the steward's office at the eastern end of the house, and it had been kept in the same hand for 11 years by a man named Dodd, who was not dishonest, only old, and whose eyes had been failing him for the better part of the last 4 years without his ever admitting the fact to anyone, including himself. The errors were small individually. That was the other thing about wrong numbers. The small ones were the most dangerous, because small ones accumulated the way water accumulates in a low place, quietly and by degrees, until one morning you walked into the low place and found yourself knee-deep in something that had been building for years. 3 years of small errors in a household the size of Calverstone added to a figure that would have alarmed anyone who totaled it correctly. No one had totaled it correctly until the girl came. Her name was Nora Vane, and she was 24, and she had arrived at Calverstone 6 days before in the capacity of under-housekeeper, which was a position she had applied for through an agency in the city of Dunwell, and which paid £14 a year and included a room at the top of the servants' stairs that was small but dry and had a window that faced east, so the morning light came in first thing. She had not come to Calverstone to correct anything. She had come because she needed £14 a year and a dry room, and because the agency had offered her the position and she had taken it, and because the alternative was going back to her aunt's house in Dunwell, and she would have slept in a ditch before she did that. Nora Vane was not a remarkable-looking woman. She was slight and brown-haired, with steady dark eyes, and a way of moving through a room that made her easy to overlook, which she had cultivated deliberately over the years, because she had found that being easy to overlook was one of the more useful things a woman in her position could be. Her position, broadly stated, was this. She was the daughter of a man who had been a clerk, a very good clerk, who had kept accounts for a shipping firm in Dunwell for 22 years, with a precision that his employers had valued and never once rewarded in any form that mattered. He had died of a fever 4 winters ago and left Nora the 3 things he had always given her, which were a head for figures, a straight back, and a clear understanding of what a column of numbers could tell you if you read it honestly. She had taken those 3 things and the small trunk they fit inside, and she had gone into service, because that was the road available to a clerk's daughter with no dowry and no connections and no particular beauty that the world might be persuaded to compensate her for. She had been a lady's companion for 2 years, which had ended when the lady died. She had been a governess for 1 year, which had ended when the family moved abroad and did not take her. She had been between positions for 3 months, which had been the worst 3 months of her adult life, and she was not going to allow herself to be between positions again if she could help it, and she could help it, and so she had accepted the under-housekeeper post at Calverstone without asking many questions about it, which in retrospect she would identify as the moment everything changed, though she did not know it was the moment everything changed until considerably later. She had been at Calverstone 6 days when she found the ledger. She had not gone looking for it. She had gone to the steward's office to ask Mr. Dodd about the linen inventory, which was part of her responsibilities, and which appeared to have last been properly done some time before she was born. Mr. Dodd was not in his office. He was, as she would learn, was his habit on Tuesday afternoons, in the kitchen, drinking tea and talking to the cook about matters unrelated to any of his duties. The door to his office was open. The ledger was on the desk, open to the current quarter's accounts, because Dodd had been working on it that morning and had left it when the pull of the kitchen became stronger than the pull of the numbers. Nora stopped in the doorway. She was not the kind of woman who went through other people's papers. She was, however, the kind of woman who could not look at an open page of figures without her eye moving automatically to the columns, the way a musician cannot hear a wrong note without flinching. Her eye moved to the columns. It found the wrong note in approximately 4 seconds. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she went into the office and sat down at the desk and began to read the ledger properly, from the beginning of the current quarter, which took her 12 minutes. Then she went back 3 quarters and read those as well, which took her another 25 minutes, and by the end of the 25 minutes, she had a very clear picture of what had gone wrong and when it had begun to go wrong, and approximately what the cumulative error amounted to, and she sat with this picture for a moment in the quiet of the empty office and thought about what a sensible woman would do with it. A sensible woman, she decided, would close the ledger and go back to the linen inventory and say nothing about what she had seen, because saying something about it would require explaining why she had been sitting at the steward's desk reading the accounts for half an hour when she had come to ask about linens, and that explanation would not improve her position in the household, and she had been in the household 6 days and was not yet in a position where she could afford to not improve her position in it. She reached out and closed the ledger. Then she opened it again, because a sensible woman was one thing, and she was that, but she was also her father's daughter, and her father's daughter could not close a wrong ledger and walk away from it any more than her father could have. She took a sheet of paper from the corner of the desk and a pen from the inkstand, and she began to work. She did not correct the ledger itself. She would not do that without permission, and in any case, it was not her ledger to correct. But she made her own clean copy of the figures, column by column, with the errors identified and the correct figures beside them, and the cumulative difference stated plainly at the bottom in her father's careful style, which was also now her own style, which was clear and small and left no room for misunderstanding. She was halfway through the 2nd page of her corrections when she heard a step in the passage outside and looked up. The man in the doorway was not Mr. Dodd. She knew that immediately, not from anything she could have specified in the first half-second, but from the way he stood, which was the way a man stands in a doorway that belongs to him, without needing to announce the belonging. He was perhaps 32 or 3, tall and dark-coated, with a face that was not cold and was not warm, and was the particular expression of a man who has learned to hold his own counsel in public, and has done it long enough that the holding has become the face itself. His eyes, which were a clear, pale grey, went first to the desk, then to the paper under her hand, then to her. He said nothing. She had the pen in her hand and the paper in front of her, and no explanation that would come out better for being hurried, so she did not hurry it. She put the pen down. She said, "I owe you an explanation."
See?
She said it to the room rather than to him, because she had not yet established who he was, and she was not going to adjust her tone to a rank she did not know. He said, "I think perhaps I owe you one first. You are sitting at my steward's desk." She looked at him. She understood from the what he was, which meant she had been correcting a duke's ledger with his own pen and ink for the better part of 35 minutes, which was not the way she had planned to spend her 6th day at Calverstone. She said, "I am Nora Vane. I am the new under-housekeeper. I came to ask Mr. Dodd about the linen inventory, and the office was empty, and the ledger was open." She paused. "I have been a clerk's daughter longer than I have been anything else, I cannot look at an open column of figures without reading it. She gestured at the paper in front of her. These are the errors in the current accounts, and the 3 quarters preceding. The column on the right is what the figures should be. The total at the bottom is the difference. I have not touched the ledger itself. She pushed the paper toward the edge of the desk so he could take it if he chose to. He came into the room and took it. He read it. He read it the way a man reads something that is telling him something he already suspected and is deciding whether to be relieved or troubled by having it confirmed. It took him perhaps 2 minutes. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at her. He said, "How long did this take you?" She said, 35 minutes for the reading and the working. He said, "My previous steward spent 3 weeks on the quarterly accounts." She said, "Your previous steward was also keeping them incorrectly. If these figures carry back beyond the current year, which I believe they do, I only had time for 3 quarters. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the paper again. He said, "They carry back further than 3 quarters." She said, "I thought they might." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "The style of the errors is the same from the first page I looked at. When a man makes the same kind of mistake consistently, across time, it means the mistake comes from the method, not from carelessness. Fix the method, and you fix the errors." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the particular experience of being seen that she had not had since her father was alive, which was the experience of a person looking at you and seeing what you actually were, rather than what they had been told to expect. It was an uncomfortable experience in the way that all honest things are uncomfortable, which is not the same as unpleasant. He said, "Miss Vane." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been looking for a secretary for 8 months. I have interviewed 11 men and found none of them satisfactory. I was not looking for a woman because it did not occur to me to look for a woman, which I now understand to have been an error of method rather than carelessness." He picked up the paper she had made and looked at it once more. He said, "The position pays £40 a year and includes the use of the office and the small library adjoining it." She sat very still. She said, "I have been the under-housekeeper for 6 days." He said, "You have been the under-housekeeper for 6 days, and in that time you have identified an error that has cost this estate a significant sum across 4 years, and have produced a cleaner accounting of it in 35 minutes than my steward has managed in 11 years. He set the paper down. He said, "I think we can agree the position is a better use of your time." She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She said, "I should like to see the accounts going back to the beginning, not just 3 quarters, all of it." He said, "You shall have all of it." She said, "I should also like it understood that if I find things that are wrong, I will say they are wrong." He said, "That is precisely what I am hiring you to do." She said, "Some people find it easier to hire someone to tell them things are wrong than to actually hear it when the things are wrong." He looked at her again with that same careful, unhurried attention. He said, "Miss Vane, I have spent 8 months being told by 11 men that my accounts were satisfactory when they were not. I have no interest in being agreed with. I have an interest in being right, which requires first being told when I am wrong." She considered him. She considered the position. She considered the £40 a year, which was more than twice what the agency had placed her on 6 days before. She thought about what her father would have said, which was that a set of accounts honestly kept was the most useful thing in the world, and that the most useful thing a person could do was the thing they did best, and she did this best. She said, "Then I accept." He nodded once. He said, "I will inform the housekeeper that your duties have changed." He turned to go. At the door he paused. He said, "The name of the position, if you require one for correspondence, is estate secretary, he said. I am Calver, she said. I know. He went out. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the office that was now in some sense hers, with the corrected figures under her hand and the morning light coming through the window, and she thought about the linen inventory that was still waiting to be done, and decided that it could wait a great deal longer, and she opened the ledger to the beginning, and began at the beginning, which was the only place she had ever known to start. She had the accounts in proper order within a fortnight. It took longer than 35 minutes because there were 11 years of them, and because the errors, once she went back far enough, became more various and interesting than the recent ones. And interesting was the word she used in her own mind for things that a more emotional woman might have called alarming. She said nothing to anyone about what she found as she found it. She kept her own clean copies in a separate book, which she kept locked, and she totaled her columns at the end of each day before she went upstairs, and she let the totals accumulate the way the errors had accumulated, quietly and by degrees, until she had the full picture. It was not catastrophic. The estate was not ruined, but it was substantially less sound than anyone had been told it was, and the distance between what it was and what it had been presented as was wide enough that several things the Duke had apparently been told were possible were in fact not possible at all, and several things he had apparently been told were not possible were in fact the only way forward. She asked to see him on a Thursday morning. She brought her 2 books, the original accounts and her own clean copy, and she sat across from him at the desk in the library, which was where he preferred to conduct this kind of meeting, and she laid both books open on the desk, and she told him what she had found. She told him plainly. She had found in the 6 weeks since she had come that he was a man who preferred plain, which made her work considerably easier, because plain was the only way she knew to tell things. He listened without interrupting. He looked at the figures when she indicated them, and he asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions, and she answered them. When she was done, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable, because it was the silence of a man absorbing information and deciding what to do with it, which was a different kind of silence from the kind that meant the information was unwelcome. He said, "The Marin investment." She said, "Yes." He said, "I was told it was the soundest of the 3. She said, "It was the least sound of the 3. It has been less sound than the others for at least 6 years. The figures in the original accounts show it correctly, if you know what to look for, but the quarterly summaries that were brought to you did not reflect what the figures showed." He said, "Dodd." She said, "Dodd's eyes have been failing him for 4 years. I do not think the summaries were deliberately misleading. I think he was summarizing from memory and from habit rather than from fresh reading of the columns, and memory and habit will reproduce what a man expects to see rather than what is there." He was quiet again. He said, "Can it be recovered?" She said, "The Marin investment, no. But the Ashfield property, which was presented to you as a liability, is not a liability. It has been incorrectly assessed. If you were to act on the correct assessment, which I can put in writing for your solicitor, the return over 5 years would more than compensate for the Marin loss." He looked at her. He said, "You have been here 6 weeks." She said, 6 weeks and 4 days. He said, "Are you always this thorough?" She said, "I am always this thorough with numbers. With other things I am sometimes less so, but numbers are what you hired me for." He said, "Among other things." She did not ask what the other things were. She had found in 6 weeks and 4 days that when a man said "among other things" in that particular way, the "among other things" would make itself clear in time, and pressing it did not make it clearer, only earlier, and earlier was not always better. She closed the second book and pushed it across the desk to him. She said, "That copy is yours. I have my own." He said, "You keep copies." She said, "Always." He said, "Wise." She said, "My father kept copies." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father was a clerk." She said, "For 22 years, for the same firm, and they never gave him so much as a character letter when he died." He said, "I intend to give you considerably more than a character letter." She said, "You have given me £40 a year and the use of the library." He said, "I have given you what the position was worth. I mean to give you more when the position expands." She looked at him. She said, "You expect the position to expand?" He said, "Every useful thing expands. Yours will." She said, "I see." He said, "Does that concern you?" She said, "It depends on the direction." He said, "The direction is upward." She said, "Then no, it does not concern me." He looked at her for a moment, and then did something she had not seen him do before, which was to smile. It was a small smile, and a brief one, and it changed his face considerably, which was the thing about a face that is usually careful. When it relaxes for a moment, the change is larger than it would be on a face that is always open. He said, "Good." He took the book she had pushed across the desk and opened it and began to read it properly, which meant the meeting was over in the way that meetings ended with him, not by being closed, but by the work beginning. She gathered her things and rose and went to the door. He said, "Miss Vane," without looking up from the book. She said, "Yes." He said, "The Ashfield assessment. How long will the written version take?" She said, 2 days, if I have the original survey papers." He said, "They are in the upper drawer on the left." She looked at the desk. The upper drawer on the left was on her side of the desk. She said, "You keep the survey papers on my side of the desk." He said, "I keep them on the side nearest the secretary." She understood from this that he had known for some time how this was going to resolve, and had arranged accordingly, and had not said so, because he was a man who let useful things develop at their own pace. She opened the upper drawer on the left. The survey papers were there. She took them and went to work. The 2 months that followed were the most productive months of Nora Vane's working life. She had not known until she was inside them that months could feel that way, that there could be days when the work was simply good, when the columns came right and the patterns clarified and the answers arrived because she had asked the right questions in the right order and her mind had been given the tools it needed to work with. She had spent 4 years in positions that used a fraction of what she had, and she had not known what the fraction felt like until she was suddenly using the whole of it, and the whole of it felt the way her father had always said useful work felt, which was like the only weather you were built for. She saw the Duke most days. Their meetings had a shape that established itself without discussion, which was the way the best working arrangements always established themselves. She brought him what needed his attention, and he attended to it, and he asked questions, and she answered them, and somewhere in the 3rd week she realized that his questions had begun to anticipate hers, which meant he had begun to read the accounts himself rather than waiting for her to summarize them, which meant he trusted the accounts now in a way he had not trusted them before, which was the best compliment anyone had ever paid her work, including with words. He was not easy. She had not expected easy and would not have wanted it. He was precise, and he was demanding, and he had a way of identifying the weakest point in any argument she made, and pressing it until it either held or gave, and when it gave, he waited for her to reconstruct it before proceeding, which was the right thing to do, and which required a patience that she had not looked for in a man of his position, and which she respected more than she allowed herself to show. She allowed herself to show very little in those 2 months, She was a woman who had learned not to show things, and the learning was deep enough by now that not showing them was not a performance, but a habit, and habits are harder to break than decisions. She showed him the work. She showed him the numbers. She showed him, when he asked for it, the reasoning behind the numbers, which was more personal than the numbers themselves, but still on the right side of the line she had drawn. She did not show him the thing that was growing on the other side of that line, which was not something she could have named precisely, or would have named if she could. She called it, in her own private accounting of it, a column that had not yet been totaled. The thing that totaled it was a small thing, as the things that total columns usually are. It was a Wednesday afternoon in October, 2 months and 11 days after she had come to Calverstone. She was in the library working on the revised projection for the Ashfield property, which had come through exactly as she had estimated, and which gave her a satisfaction she did not perform, but also did not conceal, when she heard him come in and heard him stop. She looked up. He was standing a few feet into the room, with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before, which was the expression of a man who has received news that he had not expected and is not sure yet whether it is the kind of news that can be absorbed in company or the kind that cannot. She said nothing. She waited. He said, "My mother's estate." She said, "Yes." He said, "There is a complication with the original settlement, something that should have been addressed when she died and was not." She said, "What kind of complication?" He told her. She listened. When he was finished, she said, "Sit down." He looked at her. She said, "Sit down and let me see the letter." He sat down and gave her the letter. She read it. She read it twice. She set it on the desk and looked at it, and then looked at her projection figures, and then looked at the window and worked through it, the way she worked through everything, which was by starting at the beginning and following the logic until it led somewhere. She said, "It is not as bad as it looks in the letter." He said, "It is not." She said, "The solicitor is being cautious. That is his function. But the settlement as he describes it, if the original deed is as he says it is, admits of at least 2 interpretations, and only one of them is the one he has given you." He said, "And the other?" She said, "Give me the original deed, and 2 days, and I will tell you the other." He said, "You have not read it yet." She said, "No, but I know how settlements are constructed, and I know how the complication you have described arises, and I know that when a solicitor writes in this manner, he is not telling you there is no remedy. He is telling you that the remedy is complicated, and he is not sure it falls within his particular expertise." He was looking at her. He said, "You are going to tell me you can read a settlement deed." She said, "My father spent 3 years in a solicitor's office before he went to the shipping firm. I can read a settlement deed. I may not be able to advise you as a solicitor advises you, but I can tell you what it says and what the 2 interpretations are, and you can take those interpretations to someone better qualified than your current man, which on the evidence of this letter you should probably do in any case." He looked at the letter. He said, "He has been the family's solicitor for 30 years. She said, "Then he has been reading the family's documents in the same way for 30 years. That is the same problem as the ledger. It is an error of method." He was quiet. Then he said, "The deed is in the muniment room. I will have it brought." She said, "Thank you." He rose. At the door he paused, which was a habit she had come to recognize as the moment before he said the thing he had been deciding whether to say. He said, "Miss Vane." She said, "Yes." He said, "I should like you to know that I am aware of what it means that you have been doing this work. Not just the accounts. This." He indicated the letter. She said, "It is the same work." He said, "It is not the same work," she said. "It is all columns." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You are the most useful person I have ever employed, and I am aware that useful is an insufficient word for what you are." She sat with that. She said, "What is the sufficient word?" He said, "I have not found it yet." He went out. She sat in the library with the afternoon going gold in the windows, and the projection figures on the desk and the letter beside them, and she thought about columns that had not been totaled, and she was honest enough with herself, in the private accounting she kept, to know that the column she had been refusing to total for 2 months had just had one more figure added to it, and the total was becoming difficult to ignore. She went to the muniment room that evening, after supper, when the house was quiet, and she read the settlement deed from beginning to end by lamplight, which took her the better part of 2 hours, and when she was done, she sat for a moment in the quiet room with the deed in her hands and understood 2 things. The first was that the deed did indeed admit of 2 interpretations, and the second was that the better of the 2 interpretations was also the more defensible of the 2, and also the one that a competent solicitor would reach if he read the deed without 30 years of assumption guiding his eye. The second thing she understood was that she was not going to pretend any longer, even in the private accounting she kept, that the column she had been refusing to total was about the work. It had been about the work at the beginning. It was not only about the work now. This was inconvenient, and she acknowledged the inconvenience plainly, the way she acknowledged all inconvenient facts, which was without flinching, because flinching did not change the fact. It only made the flinching also something that needed to be managed. She was the estate secretary. He was the Duke. The distance between those 2 things was a real distance, and she was not a woman who pretended distances were smaller than they were. She was also not a woman who pretended that a column did not exist when she could see it clearly on the page, and the column existed, and she could see it clearly, and what it said was what it said, and she folded that knowledge carefully and put it in the private place where she kept things that needed time, and went back to the deed. She prepared her account of the 2 interpretations the following morning and brought it to him at 10, and he read it, and he asked his questions, and she answered them, and he said, "You are right about the second solicitor," and she said, "Yes," and he said, "I will write to him today," and she said, "I have already drafted the letter if you would like to review it," and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite the small brief smile, but was in the same neighborhood, and said, "Of course you have," and took the draft, and that was the meeting. It was 3 weeks after that, before either of them said the thing that needed to be said, and neither of them said it in the library, or the office, or any of the formal places where their work had happened. They said it in the walled garden, which Nora had discovered in November to be the warmest place on the estate on a cold afternoon because of the way the south wall held the sun, and where she had taken to walking in the last hour of the daylight, when the library was too quiet to work in, and she was too full of numbers to go upstairs. He was there when she arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in November. He was not working. He was standing at the south wall, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the bare rose canes in the way that she had come to recognize as the way he stood when he was thinking about something he had not resolved. She said, "I can go." He said, "Please don't." She stayed. She walked to the wall and stood beside him at a proper distance, and they looked at the rose canes in the last of the afternoon light, which was the thin, particular gold of November, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence was not a formal silence and not a professional silence, and Nora was honest enough with herself to know what kind of silence it was. He said, "I have been trying for 3 weeks to find the right way to say a thing to you." She said, "I know." He said, "You know what I am going to say." She said, "I know what you have been not saying." He looked at her. He said, "I am also aware that I am the Duke and you are my secretary, and that the awareness should probably prevent me from saying it." She said, "It should." He said, "Yes." A silence. She said, "I have been keeping my own accounting of it." He said, "Have you?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What does it show?" She looked at the rose canes. She said, "It shows a figure that is difficult to argue with." He was quiet. Then he said, "I am not going to argue with it." He said, "I would like to know if you are going to argue with it." She thought about distances, about the real and measurable distance between where she stood and where he stood on every axis that the world used to measure such things. She thought about her father, who had kept honest accounts for 22 years and died without recognition. She thought about 11 men who had been interviewed for a position that was better suited to her, and about upper drawers arranged on the side nearest the secretary before she had been given the position. She said, "I have been sitting with the figure for some time." He said, "And," she said, "I have not found an error in it." He turned toward her slightly. He said, "I should tell you that I do not intend to keep the position as it is." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean to change it considerably." She said, "I assumed so." He said, "It would require changes that you may find inconvenient." She said, "Most useful things require inconvenient changes." He said, "Miss Vane." She said, "Yes." He said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been looking for someone who would tell me the truth about my accounts for 4 years." He said, "I did not know I was also looking for someone who would tell me the truth about everything else." He was very still, the way he was always still when he was saying something that mattered. He said, "But I was." She stood in the walled garden with the November sun on the south wall and the bare canes and the figure in her private accounting that she had not found an error in, and she thought once more, briefly and clearly, about distances. Then she thought about columns honestly kept. She said, "So was I." The rest of it does not need to be set down here in detail, because what matters about the rest of it is not the events, but what the events were made of, which was 2 people who had learned to tell the truth about numbers, learning to tell the truth about everything else, and finding that the skill transferred. There were inconvenient changes, as he had said. The position did change considerably. The county talked, as counties always do, and found after a while that the talking ran out of fuel, because there was nothing to sustain it except a duke who had married his secretary, and a secretary who had turned out to have been a clerk's daughter with a gift for figures and a sufficient quantity of straight back to put 4 years of errors right in a fortnight. The accounts of Calverstone were never wrong again. That was not because there were no more errors. Errors are inevitable in the management of a large estate, as they are inevitable in the management of anything large and human. It was because there was now a person whose function was to find the errors and name them and correct them before they accumulated, and she did that function as well as any person had ever done it, and she was not going to stop. She had been her father's daughter long enough to know that a column honestly kept was its own reward, and she had been her own kind of woman long enough to know that reward was not the only reason to keep it. She kept it because it was right. She kept it because the numbers told the truth when the people around them did not, and she had loved that about numbers since she was a child, sitting at her father's knee, watching him run his finger down a column and find the place where the truth lived. She kept it because she had been hired to do it, and because the hiring had been fair and the work had been suited to her, and both of those things were rare enough that when you found them, you did not let go of them for any reason. They came up the south wall, and she watched them from the window of the library that was now also a room she used for purposes that had nothing to do with accounts. And they were the particular deep red of roses that have been given the right conditions and allowed to grow in them, which is a different thing from roses grown anywhere, and a visible one. The Duke, her husband, came into the library one summer morning and found her at the desk with the current quarter's accounts and a cup of tea that had gone cold, which was always the sign that the work had become interesting, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, which was as though she were a figure that required reading to be understood and was worth the reading. She said, "Not yet, but I think I am about to." He sat down in the chair across from her, the way he had sat down in the steward's office on the first day, except that it was not the steward's office now, and he was not the Duke in the formal sense in this room, only himself, which was the more interesting thing of the two. He said, "Tell me when you find it." She said, "I will." She went back to the column. She found it 7 minutes later, which was a small error and easily corrected, and she corrected it in her clean, careful hand, her father's hand, the hand of a woman who had come to a great house looking for £14 a year and a dry room, and had found, among the things she had not been looking for, the one column that could not be corrected once you had totaled it, which was also the one column you would never want to correct. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next one.